My name is Walt Wolfram. I'm a professor in the English department. I'm a linguist. This is Mia Shang, who is a graduate student and works with the Language Diversity Ambassadors, which is a very active group that she'll tell you about. Our other presenter is Stephanie Dunstan, who had a last-minute conflict come up, and so she couldn't be here. The title is a little concern of ours because over the last 8 or 9 years, we've had a very active linguistic diversity campaign going in NC State. And almost sort of ironically at the same time that the diversity initiatives have started, it seems that the language diversity part of it has been somewhat neglected. And so our concern is that this is not a sort of a one-time, one-and-done trend, and that we want to keep it active. It's prominent. It's a national model that won an award for, out of 83 submissions, won the national award for innovative diversity models a few years ago. And so we don't want to lose this incentive, not simply because it's prominent, but because it's absolutely essential. And so me and I will be presenting, and we'll give a chance for questions and so forth. I realize that there are a few of you scattered around. We'll try to sort of be inclusive with our eyes, but we'll go from here, and Mia will start us off.
Great. Thanks, Walt. So we just wanted to begin with a little bit of what I'm calling Dialect 101. So some basic ideas about dialect diversity. First, I want to begin by defining a dialect as just a neutral term to refer to any language variety spoken by a group of people. So really kind of this broad, neutral term that we have. But even so, there are a lot of sort of myths that circulate around dialects and what they are and who speaks them. So we just wanted to begin by sort of addressing those ideas, those sort of myths about dialects. And some of these ideas might be familiar to you all, or maybe you haven't heard them before, but we just wanted to get everyone sort of up to speed on dialects. So the first myth we have here is that there is a single standard dialect of English, which is correct, and which everyone should strive to speak. In reality, the so-called standard English is more of an idealized language promoted by social factors like power than a linguistic reality. So linguists maintain that no dialect or language is inherently superior to another. And so this is an idea that we'll see a lot, and it is kind of entrenched in our own biases and whatnot, especially as academics. The next myth is that a dialect is something that someone else speaks, and not everyone speaks a dialect or has an accent. When in reality, everyone who speaks a language speaks some dialect of that language. So, for example, most of us here probably speak American English. That's just one example. We can get more specific with the dialect you speak, but no one's immune to speaking a dialect. And then the term accent is generally used to refer to sort of the sound system of the dialect. So if you have a dialect, then by extension, you also have an accent. So this idea of like, oh, I don't have an accent, I don't speak a dialect, but my neighbor does, or my grandma does, or something like that is not really true. Last but not least, we have this idea that dialects are ill-formed derivatives of standard English. So in other words, they are a collection of mistakes. They're bad English, they're sloppy English, they're just uneducated English. That is not true. Dialects are highly patterned, systematic, and intricate varieties of language. Dr. Wolfram here has dedicated, years and years of research to kind of exploring that systematicity and the underlying complexity of dialects. So definitely he has the science to back up the fact that this is a myth. Dialects are rule governed, they are systematic, and they are valid. So to kind of articulate these ideas into more theoretical terms and concepts put forth by Dunstan and Yeager, 2015. So standard language ideology is that idea, once again, that the standard reflects the linguistic practices of the dominant classes rather than sort of this inherently superior variety that people assume that it is. So that's kind of articulated by Lippy Green, who's a linguist. Linguistic hegemony is a byproduct of standard language ideology in which the supposed superiority of standard English is perceived as common sense. It's that rule by consent that Gramsci, theorizes. And then Delpit's codes of power, one of which is linguistic. So speakers of non-mainstream dialects confer less cultural and linguistic capital, and are thus excluded from the culture of power, especially in professional and academic realms. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Walt.
Okay, I probably don't need both of these. I'll just use this here. Yeah, that's good. This is a cartoon, which in some sense is fairly typical of universities. And one of the points that I'm going to make, and you will be perhaps shocked by this, is that not only are universities complicit with linguistic bias, that they are agents in the reproduction of linguistic bias. Some of the things that are taught in various courses about language are not sort of simple and irrelevant and trivial misconceptions. They are really significant. And this, in a sense, what this also says is that universities that can be very progressive and inclusive in other areas can be quite prescriptive and exclusive with respect to language. Okay, and that's something that has been demonstrated. As Lippy Green says, discrimination based on language variation is so commonly accepted, so widely perceived as appropriate, that it must be seen as the last back door to discrimination, and the door stands wide open. Think of this scenario. A person goes to a job interview. They're told, oh, you can't get the job because you're the wrong color, you're the wrong gender, you have the wrong sexual preferences. They go to court in a second, right? Person walks out of there, gets a lawyer, and they're in court. Somebody says, you don't get the job because your speech is not adequate for the job, goes away and feels bad about themselves, right? We have had several cases that I've been involved in forensically recently that sort of attest to some of this kind of discrimination in terms of even the identification of intoxicated speakers. So last week I was writing a deposition for a case in Iowa in which an African American was going through. He was stopped. There were no cans, beer cans or anything in the car. He was said to be using slurred speech, all right? In reality, he was using his natural dialect, which was different from rural Iowa. On that basis, he was cited for a DWI, all right? Simply because he spoke a different dialect that the officer had trouble comprehending, it was cited as disordered speech, not simply different speech. So we see these encounters in lots of everyday situations. So, and here's the thing about universities. If you see this article, it's actually this quote here: the collision of academic prejudice and accent is particularly ironic. Academics tend to the center left nearly everywhere and talk endlessly about class and multiculturalism. And yet, accent and dialect are still barely on many people's minds as deserving respect. So in that sense, what we're calling for here is we can't forget about language as a basis for discrimination. All right. Now, here's the point in academia. Academics are gatekeepers, guardians, and authorities in the use of language. The academy dictates which language varieties are included in the culture of power. Attitudes and behavior towards language diversity affect students' attitudes about themselves, the university, and participation and performance in academic life. Just a side note, in terms of universities, the original language Prejudice had students learning Greek, Latin, and other classical language, right? So there's always been this sort of orientation towards sort of highbrow. When many more students came to college and these classical languages were eliminated, the bias didn't end. So after World War II, when lots more people from the representative of the population of America came to college, they came speaking different varieties, but the attitude and the policies on language never changed. They simply changed towards the standard English, this standard English paradigm. And when we realized it, here's the situation, okay? And I'm going to be personal for a second, and then talk about NC State. So when I was 17, I grew up in inner city Philadelphia. I had a Philadelphia dialect, right? Which the farther you get away from the East Coast, sounds more and more New Yorkish. So I'd say coffee for coffee, and people, oh, you're from New York? No, I'm from Philadelphia, but it's close. All right? So actually I went to college, all right? And there I encountered people who spoke a completely different dialect. I was the only one. So they made a lot of fun of my dialect, all right? And one of the things that I did was, when I got to school, I said, oh, I assumed that everybody spoke the same way because I was raised in Philadelphia. I rarely left the city. My parents had an 8th grade education, and that was the dialect that was natural to me. All right, so I got there. 50 years later, we had a reunion of the undefeated football team that I played on, which was the last undefeated football team at the university, at the college, and they wanted to celebrate it, and so I came. So we sat in tables like this, and we went around and said, well, what do you remember from this person 50 years ago? Guess what they remembered about me? That I talked funny, right? 50 years later, that was the impression. I say, well, 2, I talked funny, I was funny, and I was really good at languages. That's what they remembered about me, all right? But it's interesting, the talk funny situation, and I'll tell you a little more about that later and how it affected me, because here's what happens. We have students coming to the university. They're from different regions around the state. So you take kids from the western part of the state, like in Appalachia or Smoky Mountains and so forth. The only dialects they've been exposed to are like the ones they speak. Because in high school, everything tends to be community focused. And there's a lot of similarity in language because there's a shared dialect in the school system by the kids. And now they come to NC State, where we have a variety of kids from all over the state and beyond. And they're exposed to different dialects for the first time, which was my situation. I was dumbfounded that people were picking on my speech as an identifying trait of who I was as a person. So a few years ago, I don't know about the ethics of saying this, so I'll just say it, and if it's unethical, we'll delete it later. So, but anyhow, we had a student here who did a study of a large urban southern university close to our hearts here at NC State, all right, of kids' impressions who were from Appalachia who came to NC State. So she did some conversations with them, and she tabulated features of their speech that were Appalachian and so forth. But she also asked them probing questions, like, how did you feel when you came here about the way you spoke? And I'm just going to quote a couple here. I don't really speak up too much in class and stuff like that unless I feel really comfortable, because I can hear, people snickering and stuff like that when I talk, all right? So that there are snickers, which is some of the reaction that I had when I went to college in Illinois. It's interesting because one of the things I do in class is I often play examples of speech. And one of the points about you can't speak English without speaking some dialect, is the vowel in a word like bought. You can't not choose a dialect. So you can say bought, like they do in the Outer Banks, and which is British kind of. You can say something like bought, where caught and caught are the same vowel. Some people largely in the Midwest and Eastern New England do that. You can also say bow, which is a traditional Southern pronunciation. Or you can say, like me, bought in New York. What's interesting, when I play this tape, when students hear the bow pronunciation, they giggle, which is really interesting because these are graduate students who are studying linguistics, and when they hear this pronunciation, they giggle. In a sense, saying, yeah, when people hear this stuff, they tend to giggle. Now, they may say, oh, no, I'm just giggling because it sounds different or down home or something. But in reality, it is a sort of giveaway. Okay, so here's another one. Sometimes I think that people might think that I'm not educated, all right? Just because I have the accent, and you hear a country accent, and you think hillbilly, and then hillbilly, no education. So I think it's just the social norm to think that way, all right? So we have these stereotypes of what people like this sound like. And here's kind of my favorite quote, because it happened a week before I was going to give a diversity quote on language. And I was coming out of my office and walking in Tompkins Hall, and I heard these two kids having a conversation. I think to the extent that I have sort of flirtation R or whatever that is, I think they were flirting. And the woman says, Asians have weird accents. They use sounds that don't exist. And the guy says, yeah. And I'm thinking, what the heck is that? How can you use a sound that doesn't exist? It's sort of like, oh, we do need to be educated about dialects here. So I thought that was kind of interesting. All right, but it doesn't stop there. It's also a characteristic of some of our most esteemed faculty, all right? So let me tell you an incident that took place. We've gotten a lot of publicity for our studies of dialect. One of my colleagues, Robin Dodsworth, has been studying sort of language shift in Raleigh, has over 350 interviews and how it changes over the years because of the inundation of Northerners and so forth. And there was a big article in the NNO when it used to have a paper production, all right, on a Sunday. And the next day I was standing at the light on Hillsborough, and a person who is no longer here but was a distinguished sociology professor came up to me and said, well, I read the article in the newspaper, and that's not how older people from Raleigh talk, not if they're educated. Now, that's kind of an interesting comment, all right? Because what does it say about her status? Well, one of the things that it says is that there's this sort of appropriated expert status, all right? That she, as a speaker of language, who's lived in this area for some time, has just as much expert status as a linguist who's measured over 10,000 vowels, plotted them, and shows the change that's taken place. So in a sense, there's also sort of, she trivializes the data. Would I ever question her statistics or the statistics of a person like we just heard talking about low poverty level education and wage and so forth, I would dare question the stats, right? But she was basically saying that they are trivial and unimportant, all right? Because she spoke the language, she listened to people, and there's something about language that makes the fact that if you're a speaker of English, you have a specialized kind of expert status. When the great Ebonics controversy took place in the 1990s, I would get on the air and argue for an hour on national radio about dialects with an economist who knew nothing about language, except that he spoke English as I did. And I would think, like, I would never argue with a physicist about principles or physical kinds of processes, but yet there's something peculiar about language that makes us all entitled to be sort of experts. And this is part of the standard language ideology, all right? So here's what was found in this study. All right, first of all, that course participation was affected. That speakers of stigmatized dialects don't feel comfortable speaking in class. That they're much less likely to speak. So if you come from a dialect area where you're just another normal speaker, and all of a sudden you're in a classroom where you're the exceptionalized speaker, it's problematic, and so you don't speak. There's also a barrier in that speaking a stigmatized dialect add barriers to socioeconomic settings. Sort of the need to prove that we're intelligent. So one of the things they used to say about me in college, well, you're actually much smarter than the way you talk, all right? Now, what were they saying when they said that? They said you speak a dialect that's stigmatized, but your intelligence, particularly in language tests, certainly exceeds that. You know, why should I be exceptionalized? And then there's the perception of belonging. Perceptions of dialect may impact students' overall sense of belonging on campus. Do I belong here? Am I isolated? You know, and there's a sense in which this even gets to sort of student attrition rates. Students, when they don't belong in college, have a tendency to leave or transfer to other colleges or community colleges and so forth. And because it's the first time in most people's lives where they're thrown into an utterly sort of heterogeneous dialect, all of these attitudes come out, including language stigmatization and status as the linguistic other. There's also an irony that at first I didn't understand, but now I've come to understand. One of the things that we found was that the colleges that were most cited as being prejudiced in terms of language were the colleges of humanities and social sciences. Now, if you know anything about NC State, most of the most progressive people are in those colleges, not in the College of Engineering, you know. This is relatively true in terms of hard sciences. And yet, this group was the group cited as the ones who were most prejudiced and made them feel the most uncomfortable in classes. And part of the reason is that in these classes, the instructors assume a role of responsibility and obligation for the kids' language. And so they're much more insistent on speaking standard English. And also proving the fact that people can be quite left-centered and progressive in some areas, and selectively exclusive and prejudiced about language. Okay, so then we have we did a follow-up study, all right? And this time we focused on faculty. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I sent a email to a third of the faculty, randomized, and said, if you're a tenured track faculty, would you be interested in talking about your experiences with language? We were interested in sort of like, what were you told when you were sort of going to be a professor about how you should talk and so forth? What was your own language background? You know, how did you come from your own language background into this sort of professorial register that you now use in classes and so forth? So we actually interviewed over 80 faculty about their language experiences. All right, and we talked about issues of language variation and use in faculty and student interaction, issues of classroom language use, stances in classroom. We also talked about the intersection of gender, ethnicity, regionality, status, and language variety. And I think, and one of the, I think you take over here? No, I keep going, okay. I'm on a tear anyhow, so. All right, so I'm just gonna give you a few quotes, okay? Obviously, people are not identified, and you wouldn't know them anyhow. So here's a Southern white professor, and we ask him a question. Well, how about different students in class? How do they talk, and what's your reaction to them? And here's what he says about an African American. And his speech patterns are very black. He's not altered his speech patterns like I see most of them trying to do when they come here. In fact, it's so much that he comes across very unprofessional, and I have a hard time. I would say I have a hard time treating him professional because he's so jivey in his talk. It's just street talk almost, the way he talks. And yet, he's throwing out big words and big concepts, and I'm like, how can you look and talk like this? Because you're really making it hard for me, okay? So we go on in the conversation, and then we ask him about other students. And he gives us his impression of a woman, all right, in the same class, and this is what he says. So I think, yes, that if I had that Midwestern voice, that I would use it. I think it definitely would, because I always notice it when someone has one, and I point it out to them. I did it just yesterday. I teach our seminar class, so I'm teaching people how to speak, right? And we had this Midwestern voice girl, and her diction was just perfect. And after she gave her seminar, I said, you know, you sound like a radio announcer. You could go into radio. I said, you've got that nice Midwestern. I said, perfect. It's just beautiful. You know, use it. And it almost sounds like questionably sexual harassment, but that's what he said, you know. But notice the difference in his reaction to his black student and his white student in the class. All right, and you take over here?
No.
No.
It was the last section, but it's okay.
Huh?
I said it was the last section, but it's okay. You're on a roll.
Okay. All right. So actually, here's what happens. There's what we call the comfortably white classroom, which is normative, standard, unmarked English. Sometimes professors will talk about regional white language as a basis for solidarity in the classroom, which is interesting because one very Southern-sounding professor, I asked her how she sort of used her language, her dialect in the classroom. And she said, well, you know, it's a bond between the students and me because they know I'm one of them. But then I thought, because before I came to NC State, I taught at a historically black institution for 20 years. Southern voices are not associated with solidarity. They're associated with racial prejudice, hostility, and opposition, you know? So what we see here, it's a very different sort of situation. She was solidifying her stance with Southern white-speaking students. What was she doing to people who didn't speak like that? Okay, and then there's this sort of, that's what I call the, and in that sense, black speech is marginalized. You know? Then there's the uncomfortably black classroom, where black speech is non-normative. Now there's an interesting thing because we had about 10 or 12 African Americans who were part of this study, and talking about language with them was much different. So, for example, one professor said, I have to realize that for lots of these white kids, I'm the first black professor they've ever had. And so in a sense, they're judging me. I feel like I can't use black language in the classroom with them, that I have to be a model, which is very different from how a white professor may feel in terms of using Southern speech. So what we do then is we exceptionalize black students and instructors. And instructors sort of don't have the flexibility that they really do have in their speech to speak all kinds of styles, how they speak in home with friends and so forth. And we see the standard English ideology forcing them to conform to this idealized standard because they become token representative of black speech to these students who are interacting with black professors for the first time. We also see gender norms, all right? So one of the studies was on, one of the dissertations that was written was on the gender norms of women and men. We found really interesting differences. Lots and lots of women have been instructed in their process of becoming an instructor of how to dress, how to talk, and how to act. We find very few male professors who've ever been instructed about that by their mentors, all right? So we have different expectations. And of course, what happens is we then make normative language, male language use, the norm. And it's the male language that is unmarked. So here's a curious sort of irony. Lots of women have been told by their instructors, don't use vocal fry, or don't use uptalk like that, because it makes you more uncertain and identifies you in terms of gender as weaker or something, all right? So they're explicitly instructed about these things, but then at the same time, they may be sanctioned for violating gender norm expectations, all right? So why do you talk more like a man in class than a woman? And so what that does, it puts them into sort of a double bind. So how am I going to talk? And there's much more flexibility that male professors don't even think about. They just sort of execute. Whereas we put our women instructors in a peculiar position in terms of what they can't do, what they can do. And at the same time, while they may have unique privileges, there's also a considerable amount of oppression. And the point, here's the final point. All right, as a linguist, let me say this. Language differences are never about language. They are about the language as it represents a different group, all right? So it's not your language per se, it's what your language represents in terms of the group you're associated with. And that's why we call it a proxy. Do you take over now?
Yes.
Okay, I knew you took over again. I just wasn't sure where.
Okay. So as gatekeepers of language, as Walt discussed, academics are really the best position to sort of break these cycles of standard language ideology in higher education. So we see that even though language variation is sort of this really important expression of diversity, as Walt mentioned, it's never really about language itself, it's about the people and how those sorts of social characteristics are reflected in our language. Even though it is this sort of symbolic manifestation of diversity, it's ironically excluded or erased from diversity programs, not only at NC State, but of course at colleges and professional workplaces around the country. So universities sort of become these central sites where linguistic subordination is reproduced and enabled. I think you messed up the order. So basically, we have what is called Educating the Educated. That's our program here at NC State that Walt and Stephanie Dunstan have led, and it's supposed to be interdisciplinary, so we have programs and workshops across colleges, departments, sort of cross-administrative, and these technological programs as well. We have a comprehensive audience with student, faculty, and staff orientations. With student involvement, we have the language diversity ambassadors who give different presentations and workshops to classrooms, to faculty, to staff. And then we have comprehensive resources for personnel, online resources used for integration to classroom instruction and curriculum and whatnot. So to speak a little bit from my role as a language diversity ambassador, once again, this is the graduate student organization composed of students whose concentration is linguistics in the English MA program. So one of the major ways that we sort of have this outreach in public education is through these presentations and workshops that we give both to faculty and staff and also students. So last year, we gave one faculty workshop to the Department of English. We opened it up to all departments, though. We had a few folks from communications join us, but largely the audience was sort of limited to the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. So that's one point that we want to improve upon is kind of, once again, aiming for that more cross-disciplinary reach that we are aiming for. We also, in this academic year, gave one campus organization workshop, so we presented to the GLBT Center on not only language diversity in general, but also a little bit about queer linguistics and how those identities are expressed through language. And that was really successful, kind of opening up to faculty and staff who are doing that sort of diversity training. It was the GLBT Lunch and Learn, for those of you who are familiar with that. And so we do have sort of organizations, campus organizations, reaching out to us, asking for these sorts of workshops from the language diversity ambassadors. But of course, our main presence is through the classroom presentations that we give. We mostly give these to first-year writing classrooms. We've received a couple requests from other departments. I think there was a science and technology and society professor who reached out asking for a presentation. We've gotten a couple from a high school instructor recently and a professor at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. But most of them take place in the English 101 classroom. And that's mostly a product of sort of the bottom-up approach that we've taken. So I myself am a graduate teaching assistant for FirstYear Writing for English 101. Several of my fellow language diversity ambassadors are as well. And so we've kind of been pushing this among our colleagues who are also teaching, saying, hey, look, we'd love to come talk to your class about language diversity. We think it's really important. Many of them attended that faculty workshop last year, and so they were already kind of like interested and ready to host us, so we kind of capitalized on that energy. And so you see that this really is a bottom-up approach. So we haven't really received much institutional support, even from something like the FirstYear Writing program, although we have been in contact about, them hosting programming as part of the sort of like May workshop that we're required to do. But really, it's just been reaching out kind of on an interpersonal basis, being like, hey, we would love to present to your classes, even just in like texting in group chats and publishing our workshop request form that you can see here. This is on our website, and so sending that out, basically spreading the word by word of mouth, basically. So it has sort of been this kind of localized impact that we've had, spanning from the linguistics program, the linguistics graduate students, and like furthering the reach into these first-year writing classrooms, which of course is great because English 101, first-year writing, of course, it's a required course for all students in their first year to take, and so it's often sort of this site of gatekeeping and socializing students into the normative uses of English in academia. And so being able to present to these classrooms is great to kind of, let students know that their dialects are valid, that language diversity is something to be celebrated rather than pushed to the margins of the classroom. But once again, we would love to see a little bit more of that cross-disciplinary reach, have it be a little bit more broad-reaching rather than just localized to essentially the linguistics programs and the classrooms of graduate teaching assistants. Another thing that we are working on as the language diversity ambassadors is on the online outreach program. So we've started an infographic series alongside an Instagram outreach series. So these are a couple of examples. That is an infographic on Lumbee English that I made, and then this is one of 10 slides on Black American Sign Language that my classmate and fellow language diversity ambassador Brody McCurdy made. And so essentially the goal of this is to sort of educate public audiences about these non-mainstream dialects, these vernacular dialects that are often stigmatized, and kind of show the public that language diversity is something to be celebrated, that dialects are rule governed, they're systematic, kind of dispel the sort of myths that we discussed in the beginning of the presentation, and also to just kind of raise this awareness in that way. And so we've received a really positive response on social media across Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. We've reached thousands of people and gotten hundreds of shares. Definitely the communities, especially that we make these infographics about, are really receptive and appreciative to see, the fact that an institution like NC State is sort of lending it that validity, that it is something to be celebrated rather than put down. So once again, a lot of the current momentum behind educating the educated is located with the language diversity ambassador. So it kind of does feel like sometimes it's the graduate students kind of doing this heavy lifting alongside Walt, who's obviously always willing to give presentations about the importance of language diversity in professional and educational settings, but we see that there are some gaps. And so to kind of revisit the design of the program and locate those gaps, like I said, we are sort of missing that support at the institutional level. Once again, this could be large scale at the Office of Institutional Equity and Diversity, to have more policies and programs from them, to be a little bit more included in sort of the diversity events and programming that they have going on. But even on the smaller scale, like I said, the FirstYear Writing program, if we were able to kind of host something through them officially, so that ensures the continuation beyond just the the efforts of a few ambitious and slightly annoying grad students like myself. And of course, we want to see that this sort of programming and these public outreach efforts span across departments, across colleges, and kind of receive that broad interdisciplinary support, because it can't just be something that's localized to the Department of English or even just to CHAS. We do want to see that this is something that spans across the university. This is something that touches everyone's lives. It's not just people in the humanities and social sciences. Speakers of vernacular dialects or non-mainstream dialects don't just enter humanities and social sciences. Obviously, you're going to find them across disciplines, so we want to make sure that we're having that influence as well. And remembering that NC State does sort of have this opportunity to be a model for other universities across the country. As Walt said, Educating the Educated is an award-winning program, and we want to ensure its continued success and continuation into the future. So in sum, we really do need those top-down policies, but bottom-up programs. So once again, the language diversity ambassadors are here and ready to help and love to kind of do that public outreach and education, but we do need a little bit more of the institutional support to make sure that this is something sustained.
let me just add something since since I was here 8 or 9 years ago when we started this initiative. But here's what we did. In a 18-month span, we did over 50 workshops for faculty, for staff, for support staff. You know, we integrated it into orientation. We produced a 5-minute video on language diversity at NC State. How many of you have seen that? Okay, would you guys, and we're going to end this, but the point I'm trying to make, we did pre and post follow-up studies, so we researched the effect of it. We have online resources. We have students ready to visit and give presentations. It seems like now that we're in the equity stage of our university, that someone has forgotten about the significance of language diversity. And believe me, it's not one and done. You know, that would be like going to a Billy Graham meeting, getting saved, and walking off. This is something that needs to be consistently, because it's consistently endorsed and advocated, because it's so critical and operates on such a seemingly counterintuitive approach to language. We've all been socialized into sort of the ideology of the supremacy of standard English. And it's simply a construct that falls out of the social dominance of particular classes in our society who speak that way. So let me end, and then you can ask questions and make comments with the video that we produced about 6 or 7 years ago. Do you have that there? So the dialect of Warrington, it's a little different from here, huh?
Right.
So
Just like my friends, they don't know what a pack of nabs is. They
don't
call
know
it a pack of peanut butter crackers. We call it a pack of nabs.
Well, most of my life, I ended up coming back and forth to Raleigh. So I'm pretty adjusted to the accent. But a lot of people tell me I have a country accent.
Do you think you do?
Yes, but it's not indicative of Franklinton. I just have a different. My mama doesn't sound anything like me. It's just the way I talk, I guess.
When I got here, or when I go somewhere else, people can tell that I'm from an urban area because I talk differently. It definitely is a different dialect because I guess there's a certain slang to our words that how we talk in Durham, so.
Where is Chapel Hill? You're on here?
Oh, we took Chapel Hill off.
I was actually born in Charleston, South Carolina, and then I went to England when I was 5.
So how do people react to your speech?
They don't understand why I don't sound like I'm from here, even though I'm technically from here and that kind of stuff.
There's quite a good mix of different dialects, you know.
But nobody who speaks the Ocracoke
I don't believe I've run into anyone with some brogue yet.
Hey, have a good evening. When I came down here, I thought most people with Southern accents, there was only one sort of common Southern accent, if you can say that. And now that I've been here, I realize, no, there's very different kinds of dialects that people speak with different twangs, some of them more pronounced than others.
Kentucky is technically the South, and I have what some people would say is a Southern accent. I sometimes say that the mountains are on my tongue, and I think that if you embrace dialects, you're embracing people in different cultures.
I feel very strongly that language is a critical part of how we acquire and learn culture. And so to the extent that North Carolina State is an institution that serves all of North Carolina, and in that very broad sense, the language and the dialects and what you hear on campus is part of the vibrant sort of environment that makes this truly a university.
I think that supporting language diversity is one of the strong points about NC State. They always say, I love your accent, and then we'll go from there. So where's this accent from and things like that. Then I'll talk about Cameroon.
I have all 10 colleges represented in my world population and through prospect scores in many, many countries. So we use the linguistic diversity in my classroom to build trust and confidence and respect, and it makes all the difference in the world by the end of the semester.
我来自北京，我在北卡罗来纳州立大学学习社会语言学。
Mi nombre es Daniel Marcelo Farfán Extremadoiro, soy de La Paz, Bolivia.
Fast, especially my advisor, I had problems getting almost half of what he was saying, but right now I'm good at it, and you can hear I'm also getting some of the accent.
Your dialect sort of depends on where you grew up at, and that kind of defines you as a person, but I don't necessarily think it'll define your goals or how you act or what you do.
Oh, Guilford, oh, Greensboro right here.
There are students here that, sound like a stereotypical Southern person, but they still attend the top university, and I guess that helps it out.
Yeah, they're still excelling, so definitely, I guess it breaks the stereotype or says that, like, even if we are country or we're a farming school, like, we're the top. We are intelligent, so we're proud of that.
Born and raised in Hickory, North Carolina. Growing up, we were like the only Chinese family around. I teach English 101 here, so I get to teach students, like incoming first years, about language diversity and about dialects, and have them re-examine their own language prejudices. Language is a part of their natural life, so it's something that they can readily talk about and, and embrace.
Issues of language diversity are really complex. They're interwoven with other issues of race and sex and gender, and they make up one part of our identity. And it's really difficult to try to tease one out from the other. And so since we have a general awareness that it's not right to discriminate against people based on sex, on race, sexual orientation, these types of things, we're just trying to raise awareness that part of all these other identities is really tied up in the language that people use. And when we do discriminate against people based on their language, we're also discriminating in them based on their sex, their gender, their ethnicity, etc.
We're proud that we have students from all 100 counties in the state, and we're equally proud that we have students from 53 different states and territories in America, and we have students from 119 different countries. So literally, you can walk across this campus and experience a myriad of dialects.
Where else would you find this many people from so many different places in one little spot?
Where finding the natives is hard.
Yes, it's very hard to find the natives.
A YouTube channel that has over 51,000 subscribers and has almost 18 million views over the years, including 14 documentaries of everything from Black Sign Language to Cherokee to the Outer Brogue. All of these are resources that were provided, and actually, I want to keep up the incentive, and I don't want, ironically, linguistics and language diversity to be excluded from the diversity canon. That's our point. So if you have any questions, comments, snide remarks, we'll accept any. Yeah. Go ahead.
Am I on? There we go. I will definitely not start with a snide remark. That would be, this is Sherry Schwab, Vice Provost for Institutional Equity and Diversity. So I will say I really appreciated your presentation, and I don't know how many other folks, but I was not even aware of this program. So I'm glad I stayed in on this conversation with so many great choices as well to see at the symposium today. So let's set up an appointment and talk about this, and please let any intervening periods of time where this hasn't been lifted up or continued, let's try to see what we can do moving forward.
We've had a few changes in that office.
Yes, we have. Yes, a few changes over time.
With them, so that's exactly what I want. when I go speak at other universities about that, I say, be sure to invite the officer of diversity in university.
Yes.
Because if I can't talk to them, I can't talk to anybody.
Absolutely.
So I will set up a follow-up interview and we'll chat.
Great. How about I will set one up with you? So I'll take the lead on setting something up with you. How's that sound?
That sounds
Perfect.
even better.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Other questions?
Hi, I just want to say I've been a fan of Dr. Wolfram since the documentary where the speaker humorously talks about ice cream. I don't know what year that was.
It's a good one.
But that was really hilarious. As a staff member at the university in a communications role, I wanted to know how the two of you feel this topic relates to the written word, because whereas my colleague just yesterday said her and I went to the presentation and I wouldn't say anything about that, if she gave me something to edit that said that, I would certainly change it according to our organizational brand guide. Are brand guides instruments of oppression, and should we get rid of them? Or how does the spoken dialect translate over to the written word?
Do you want to speak that? Okay, that's really a good issue. And actually, it can be confronted in several ways. People are aware of the fact that we have different registers for different things. And so that's one of the things that we can talk about. What we don't talk about, however, is that as being incorrect. You know, it is not appropriate for a given sort of situation or style any more than sort of it would be appropriate for me to wear a suit to a basketball, you know. I was playing basketball and I wore a suit, or the opposite. So I think that can be confronted. It's also important, I know that Mia in her syllabus has a statement about dialect diversity, and that students can actually use their dialects in their writing. She will make it aware of them, but it's really their choice to sort of change it. But she can talk more about that.
Yeah, essentially I have a language diversity statement in my syllabus. First and foremost, kind of affirming dialects in my classroom more generally, and saying that this is a space where everyone's native dialect is welcome. But as far as the written sort of aspect of that, definitely as a writing instructor, this is kind of an interesting question and somewhat difficult to approach. But you know, I tell my students that I'm essentially not going to grade their grammar. First of all, as a writing instructor, that's just too low-level concern for me to really nitpick that for every single paper that I read. But also giving them the opportunity, like I told them, you know, I'm not going to teach you sort of like the prescriptivist rules, but if that's something that you are interested in and like you feel like you want to improve that, I definitely give them the option to seek that further help from me in office hours. I'm like, I'd be happy to set up a time. We can talk about that. So it's really a matter of, for me, giving, you know, not actively disadvantaging my students, but focusing more on kind of more global concerns, you know, the effectiveness of their communication, where it impedes understanding. You know, if I'm not able to detect what they're trying to say in their writing, then I'm obviously going to comment on that. But really sort of giving them, you know, the opportunity to pursue that further help if that's something they're interested in, not denying them that sort of familiarity with the conventions of standard written English, but also kind of doing things in the classroom to affirm their dialect, not only in speech, but also in writing. So I think what Walt is referring to is that I don't necessarily specify that they can write in their native dialect in all assignments, but I do have an assignment, a sociolinguistic autobiography, in which I encourage them to write in their native dialect, to kind of write in the way that feels most comfortable to them. I tell them that I'm pretty familiar with different dialects and structures, so I will be able to understand it. And so to using that to let them see that their dialect not only is welcome in the classroom and just this very, in this one sort of medium of speech, but also that it can, it can be in writing for specific purposes, for specific contexts, for specific writing occasions. So trying to lend some validity to that in that way, I guess.
I have a story. Can I tell you this story?
Of course you do.
So I went to college, right, from inner city Philadelphia, and I know you won't believe this, I never wrote an essay in high school. So we got to college, and I got into Freshman Writing 101, and we had our first assignment. We had to write an essay of 500 words, and I used all the big words I knew, which wasn't very many. And I wrote this essay, and this was my first. I was the first of 6 children, the youngest, who went to college, right? And I was there primarily to play football and basketball, not to become a student. But so I got the first assignment back. I got a double F. An F in content and an F in mechanics. So not only did I have nothing to say, but I couldn't say it. All right? And then she wrote something, "You need help." All right? So I got a little help. It was one of the few C's I ever got in college, and you weren't supposed to change writing instructors at midterm. We had a year of it. But I went to the football coach and I said, "Coach, can you help me out here? Something's wrong. I just need someone who sort of is a little more tolerant." And so they changed me to Ms. Ludwigson, okay? Now with Ms. Ludwigson, all right, she told me to write every day. I could write stories, I could write poetry, and I realized that I had a voice, all right? My mechanics still sucked. But that transformed me into thinking that I had something to say, and if I had something to say, then I was willing to go through the agony of saying it in a way that was acceptable to people. So that transforming experience led to, more than 20 books, 300 articles, and a life as a writer, simply because someone made a difference in my life in the second semester of freshman writing.
Any other questions? Oh.
Thanks. I'm interested to know in the Educating the Educated and the Language Ambassador programs, do you seek to address both diversity of dialects and sort of English as a second language? Clearly, we have lots of international people on campus, and there are also communication and spoken and written language issues around that. So I'm curious if you address both of those, and if you would draw a border between them and where that border is, if you could just speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, we do consider both. I mean, a lot of our focus has been on sort of native speakers of American English, but certainly issues of accent are real issues in lots of our schools, where we have sort of complaints about TAs who can't speak English and so forth. And so we are aware of that, and actually did one of our workshops a few years ago on that topic. So we are interested, because we've done our research primarily in sort of dialects, American English kinds of dialects. We tend to focus on that, but we are totally interested. We became involved a few years ago. There was a Duke controversy about banning Chinese on campus. We got involved in that, and now I work with Duke on a series which was a direct result of that in terms of language diversity. So we do that.
I will add that just another side note about my language diversity statement in my syllabus. I do address that. I say that I'm welcoming of all linguistic backgrounds. Of course, we will be using English as our lingua franca in the classroom, but like all sort of languages and dialects that people are bringing in are valid. They are welcome. And then more in terms of the programming with the language diversity ambassadors and our presentations, I think that as Walt mentioned, there does seem to be a little bit more emphasis on native speakers of English or dialects of English more specifically, but sort of the principles that we're talking about are applicable to these, I guess, second language learners as well. And we do try to kind of, at least when I give the presentations, ask where like people are from, get an idea of who's in the room, and sort of use that as like a jumping off point to have those discussions about linguistic discrimination, because it isn't just against, as we all know, it isn't just against speakers of non-mainstream dialects of English, but also second language learners, different speakers of different languages. So kind of having an idea of who your audience is like very helpful in that way in addressing those sorts of concerns.
All right, we probably have time for one more question, and then our next session will start.
So I have two questions. So the first one is about your study with the undergrads. I noticed you said that the departments of humanities and the social sciences were harsher. Do you think that this is because, like, with the engineering and science-based and programming-based fields, that it's product-focused in terms of like how they can produce their work as opposed to communicating their work?
Yeah, I think it is, and part of it is the fact that okay, so you have English departments and other humanities, and they see it as their role as the gatekeepers of language. It's our job as English teachers in composition to get these kids to talk right, and so that sort of puts them more in a prescriptive position, whereas in sciences, as you said, it's more product-oriented. Like, nobody really cares if you use is or are, but they do care if you get the right answer. And so I think there's something to that, yeah. Second question.
And the second question was in terms of how this is produced. So I'm a graduate student in the College of Education, and my focus is special ed, especially at the elementary level. And so my question is, how do you think how we view language, especially educators, in the lower level and elementary level classrooms? How is that stifling their interest in writing, linguistics, expression, personal narratives?
Yeah, I think it's critical. As a matter of fact, one of my background things that I don't talk about a lot is when Sesame Street started in the 60s, I was a linguistic consultant to Sesame Street, which probably says more about my age than anything. We had a deliberate program in which we had different voices represented, because one of the things that we found is that kids at 3, 4, and 5 can be very prejudicial about dialect. So one of my former students ran an experiment in which she had puppets in a box who wanted kids to take a tablet and a box of crayons, all right? And she used, we're trying to get attitudes of 3, 4, and 5. So she used different dialects to entice the kids to take the crayons. And then she asked them afterward sort of why she didn't take the crayons from that person and took it from another. And they said, because that person sounds mean. And what we saw was they were associating, one of them was one was a black voice and one was a white voice, and they were associating the black voice as a 3, 4, and 5-year-old as being a disfavored voice. So what it shows is that kids develop prejudices very early, and one of the things we were trying to do with Sesame Street was to acclimate the audience to different voices to sort of make sure that they felt that they were more natural, yeah. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
With the studies you just mentioned, with them finding the black voices to be more harsh, was that across races for the child participants?
Yeah, she mostly did it with white kids, and you're quite right. It might be quite the opposite for black kids taking the crayons. She only did it with white kids, but you're quite right about that. It may be a case of familiarity, yeah.
Thank you all for coming. If you could join me in a round of applause for our presenters.